As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia, Episode 8, First Fleet Arrives. Last week we met Arthur Phillip, who in late August 1786 was recalled from his spying mission in France and told that he would be the man entrusted with the great mission of making the New South Wales punt a winner. Immediately upon his appointment, Phillip began consulting with Sir Joseph Banks, absorbing all he could about this distant land. Banks likely told Phillip verbally about the glory of the harbour just north of Botany Bay. But Banks was more a visionary than a logistics guy, and so he didn't play an active role in the preparations. The First Fleet was initially expected to depart just 2 months after Cabinet had made the decision to go. Time was of the essence if they were to beat the French. It didn't, however, depart for 9 months. Robert Hughes claims the delay was caused by the inefficient planning of a slothful government struggling to be excited about the project. He presents the First Fleet preparations as so hopelessly disorganised, it was tantamount to criminal negligence to let them depart. Alan Frost, more correctly, says the delay was because Arthur Phillip insisted nothing be left to chance. Phillip combined an obsessive attention to detail with a frenetic work ethic in this period. We reviewed Phillip's career last episode, and in light of that, it looks like Phillip may have been promoted beyond his CV. So the ambitious Phillip was determined to surprise on the upside. Alan Frost argues Prime Minister Pitt micromanaged the big picture arrangements, while Phillip micromanaged the details. The Home Office under Lord Sydney had official oversight of the project, but it was an all-of-government operation. The Treasury, the Admiralty, the Navy Board, the India Board, the Foreign Office, the Board of Ordnance, the Board of Longitude, and other agencies threw their resources and energy into the effort. 800 administrative letters regarding the First Fleet prep were exchanged in these 9 months. No doubt as many meetings and informal discussions took place. Phillip was the epicentre of it all. He dominated the decisions around selecting the officers, the supplies, the medicines, the farming equipment, the type of convicts, the form of government. Lord Sydney backed him at every step. More than once, Phillip grew exasperated with the bureaucracy. His frustration was that many involved in the planning assumed the First Fleet's voyage was on par with an Atlantic crossing. But an Atlantic crossing was just a 6-week trip. The First Fleet would be an 8-month voyage. And when a ship arrived in America, those aboard were greeted by a functioning society. The First Fleet would arrive on the far side of the world, be entirely isolated, and would need to build a society from scratch. At one point, Phillip snapped at a bureaucrat, "If you do not do what I ask, at least let the world know I was asking." When the Marines were told that they would not have alcohol, they protested and persuaded Phillip. So Phillip nagged the bureaucrats until 3 years' supply of grog was loaded aboard. Phillip had a private audience with King George III on the 3rd of January 1787 in St James's Palace. Meetings with the monarch are never spoken about, but no doubt this was a moment of awe for the Cockney and inspired him to give his all. Parliament had been in recess since the Cabinet decided to launch the First Fleet back in August 1786. On the first day back, on the 23rd of January 1787, King George III addressed Parliament and, keeping the details sparse, declared,
"A plan has been formed by my direction for transporting a number of convicts, and you will no doubt not take such further measures as may be necessary for this purpose."
According to Phillip's formal instructions, New South Wales stretched from the very northern tip of Australia at Cape York to the very bottom of Van Diemen's Land in the far south, plus 2/3 of the entire continent. They still sort of recognised a vague Dutch claim in the western part of New Holland. But Cook had only claimed the coastal strip on the east. Now they were claiming an area twice as large as the then United States. It's probably the largest land claim in history, behind Columbus declaring that most of the Americas were Spanish. The size of the claim alone more than hints this whole Botany Bay thing was a lot more than a faraway jail. But convicts were still central to the mission. No part of the First Fleet prep did Arthur Phillip micromanage more than the conditions of the convicts. He insisted on good clothing, reasonable conditions on board the ships, and acceptable accommodation on arrival. The convicts would enjoy the same food as the regular Marines. Philip was going to be spending several years in exile with a ton of convicts. He did want to steer these felons towards rehabilitation. He didn't want to risk a convict uprising, though the colony would be rocked by one in 1804. Just prior to departure, a poem had appeared in a London paper.
They go to an island to take special charge, much warmer than Britain and 10 times as large. No custom house duty, no freightage to pay, and tax-free they'll live when in Botany Bay.
Pre-dawn, on Sunday, the 13th of May, 1787, the First Fleet sailed away from the naval base in Portsmouth on the English south coast. Arthur Phillip was 48 years old. He had 1,500 souls aboard 11 ships. Many would never see England again. On that same day, Captain Laperouse of the Royal French Navy was somewhere in the South China Sea, but heading north to the Russian Pacific coast and away from Botany Bay. As we will see in this episode, 136 days after the First Fleet departed, Laperouse received orders from Paris to sail directly and immediately for Botany Bay. The race was on for one of history's biggest land claims. Philip had a few months' head start, of course, but he was also starting much farther away than Laperouse. Both captains were aware there was a reasonable chance they were heading for a geopolitical dispute over claiming New South Wales, or what the French continued to call New Holland. But Philip was one step ahead. He knew Botany Bay was a decoy destination. The French were oblivious that the real prize was the greatest natural harbour in the world, just 14 kilometres north of Botany Bay, the glorious but semi-concealed Port Jackson, which the world knows today as Sydney Harbour, but its official name then and now remains Port Jackson. The Jackson of Port Jackson was Sir George Jackson, a naval administrator, who was friends with Captain Cook. Perhaps Cook had named it after someone who was not overly prominent as part of his disguise. Port Jackson is semi-concealed because when a ship is on the ocean and sailing past, those aboard will see a grand entrance, but then what looks like only a small bay inside that entrance. It's not until one actually ventures inside that they see the entrance turns a corner to reveal a deep, spectacular harbour with endless branches. We don't often think of the strategic value of harbours today, but in the 18th century, the world was powered by ocean-faring ships, and a safe harbour was everything. The First Fleet consisted of 11 ships with a ton of supplies and equipment on board, which could have made them juicy targets for pirates. Britain was enjoying a short interval of peace in 1787, but it would be a long voyage and prudent to assume war could break out along the way. Then, of course, there was the threat of Laperouse either on his way to Botany Bay or possibly already there, and he might be up for a skirmish of some description. So the Royal Navy lent the project 2 naval escorts to provide security, plus comfort for Philip and his officers. The HMAS Sirius was the flagship of the fleet, a 20-gun naval frigate, a minnow in the Royal Navy, but it was fast and had enough firepower to see off most attacks. The other warship was the HMS Supply, smaller but faster again. The other 9 ships were merchant vessels hired from a private contractor. 6 of those carried the convicts: the Alexander, the Charlotte, the Friendship, the Lady Penrhyn, the Prince of Wales and the Scarborough. The 3 others were packed with what they thought would be 2 years of supplies: the Fishburne, the Golden Grove and the Borrowdale. All up, there were around 1,500 aboard. Just over half, 775, were convicts. Many Irish and a few Scottish convicts would follow in the decades ahead. But the convicts aboard the First Fleet were almost entirely English and overwhelmingly Londoners and from the rural surrounds of the great capital. There were already plenty of challenges for Philip on this vanguard voyage, and he did not want to add sectarian tension. Catholic-Protestant rivalry has petered out today, but was intense at this time. When Britain was sending convicts to America, they had typically been found guilty of a serious crime that didn't quite reach the threshold for the death penalty. Britain just wanted baddies banished. But Philip didn't want hardened crims. He selected for healthy petty crims, with the potential to rehabilitate into lifters, not leaners. 2/3 of the convicts were under the age of 30. None had been sentenced for murder or rape. Many were first-time offenders. The top 3 offences were theft, breaking and entry, and highway robbery. 44% were labourers with a few professional skills with things like carpentry, weaving, brickmaking, etc. 1 in 4 convicts were women, and more than half of the women were domestic servants, often caught stealing from their employer. 11 ships needed around 320 sailors to get them safely to the other side of the world. All the ships, bar the Sirius and Supply, would leave the colony by July 1788 and resume their role as trading ships between Asia and Britain. Most sailors departed at that time, which was 6 months after the first fleet arrived, but a handful would see a good future in this new world and opted to become free settlers. A prison colony needed a ton of prison guards. Philip didn't want a Spartacus-style convict revolt when the nearest British backup was half a world away in India. So a special military unit was created, the New South Wales Marine Corps, for the purpose of
enforcing subordination and obedience in the settlement at Botany Bay, as well as for defence of that settlement against the incursions of the natives.
Typically when someone joined the British Marines, they were signing up for life. But those who volunteered for the New South Wales Marine Corps were well paid and permitted to discharge after their 3-year stint in the colony. They were effectively being paid danger money. Philip insisted the Marines be well treated. That was humane but also strategically wise. Yes, the convicts could rise up, but so could the heavily armed Marines if the colony descended into a Lord of the Flies dystopia. Philip's goodwill towards the Marines, however, would not be repaid. When the First Fleet departed, there were around 270 Marines and officers, more than one Marine for every 3 convicts. The Marines brought about 50 wives and kids. The rounding out of the contingent aboard the First Fleet were around 50 civil servants who would help Philip lay the foundations for a society sort of based on English law, which we will explore in a coming episode. Plus there were an unclear number of free settlers. Most historians of this period suggest no more than a dozen or two because they are preoccupied with the oppression of convicts, and so actual willing volunteers for New South Wales doesn't fit the narrative. I have a hunch there may have been a few more free settlers than appreciated. I'd base that on a report in the Times of London just prior to the First Fleet's departure, that the flattering descriptions of Botany Bay had, quote, induced a great number of the lower ranks to accompany the felons. Along the way, the First Fleet would call in at 3 ports. The first was the Spanish-controlled Canary Islands in the mid-Atlantic, where they arrived in early June 1787. Food and water was resupplied and legs stretched. Philip sent a letter to Sir Joseph Banks from the Canary Islands, thanking him for his
very friendly and polite attention, and of assuring you that I shall be happy on every occasion that offers to show how much I wish to retain a place in your memory.
Banks would have an ongoing keen interest in the colony until his death in 1820. The second port of call was Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. But hang on, why detour all across the Atlantic to South America and then sail back across the Atlantic to reach southern Africa? No question it looks much quicker on a map to just sail down the West African coast rather than zigzagging across the Atlantic. But by now it was well known that the currents and winds made it quicker to sail near South America and then across the South Atlantic to the southern tip of Africa. Additionally, Philip was well known and well liked in Portuguese Brazil, and so the First Fleet was welcomed with a grand official welcoming party. Rio was the last port where Philip was certain he could get all he needed at reasonable prices. He had also realised he was perilously short of ammunition and was able to buy plenty from his Portuguese friends. Philip fed the convicts so much fresh food in Brazil they appeared healthier than when they had left England. One of the officers wrote home from Rio and said of Philip,
I believe few could have been found better calculated for the occasion than our commander. He is a man who has seen much of the service and much of the world and has studied it. He is possessed of great good sense, well informed, indefatigable upon service, is humane and at the same time spirited and resolute.
Philip then headed across the South Atlantic on his way to the final port of call, what we know today as Cape Town, South Africa, but which the English at the time simply referred to as the Cape. This was the pre-Suez Canal era, and so the Cape was a busy cosmopolitan port with endless ships of many nations on their way between Europe and Asia. As Philip was sailing for the Cape, Captain Laperouse of the French Navy received orders to drop everything he was doing and sail immediately for Botany Bay. Why? As the First Fleet preparations were unfolding, French spies in England were no doubt sending home all the intel they could. In December 1786, a few months into those preparations, France sprang into action and sent urgent instructions to Laperouse via a courier all the way across Europe and Siberia. When Laperouse arrived at a Russian port, on the 5th of September 1787, he and his crew were sorely disappointed to find no mail awaiting them. After 3 weeks of rest and recreation at this Russian port, Laperouse was preparing to resume his voyage and go further north. The evening before departure, however, the friendly local Russian governor put on a farewell ball for his French friends. Laperouse was bored during that ball, but then a joyful shout erupted across the room at the news that a large suitcase filled with mail from Paris had arrived for Laperouse and his crew. Laperouse was effectively told by the French Minister for the Navy,
"The British are on their way to colonize Botany Bay, so you shall go to Botany Bay. Go directly to Botany Bay. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200, and definitely don't take a detour looking for treasure islands."
So Laperouse did head off for Botany Bay, but for the second time he disobeyed orders and first sailed around in circles looking for some treasure islands in the North Pacific. Why did he think they were there? They had been speculated about for 2 centuries, but then it was claimed by none other than Captain Cook's journal that they had been found and featured in Cook's published map of the North Pacific. That deception was made after Cook had been killed, so it was the Admiralty back in Britain that inserted those islands to confuse mariners from rival nations. The Admiralty had no idea how much of a return that small investment would pay. Laperouse wasted 3 weeks looking for fake news treasure islands. On the 22nd of October 1787, Laperouse gave up his wild goose chase and did now sail directly for Botany Bay. On that same day, Arthur Phillip and his first fleet were docked at the Cape on the southern tip of Africa. The Cape, of course, was more than a Dutch port. It was a 136-year-old thriving colony surrounded by productive farms that the locals happily sold to the ships coming and going. But initially, the Dutch refused to sell Phillip's supplies on account of a recent drought in the area, plus, of course, lingering geopolitical suspicion. There had been 4 Anglo-Dutch wars in the prior century. But diplomatic Phillip persisted and was able to buy, at seriously inflated prices, many half-grown fruit trees and farm animals. The first fleet now had 500 live animals aboard: cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, horses, geese, ducks, rabbits, plus some dogs and cats and no doubt some illegal stowaways in the forms of rats and mice. After a month at the Cape on the 12th of November 1787, the first fleet set out on the final leg into the unknown, and it truly was the unknown. No one aboard had previously seen New South Wales. At each of these 3 ports, Phillip bought all the citrus fruit he could and insisted everyone eat up. The curse of the sea was scurvy, the mysterious disease that had slain so many on so many voyages. Decades earlier, a Scotsman claimed citrus prevented scurvy. He didn't know why, we do, vitamin C, but the Scot insisted it worked. Naval bureaucrats didn't accept that fringe view till much later. Phillip, like Cook, however, had sympathy for the citrus theory, and it worked. There were only 5 to 10 scurvy deaths on the first fleet. 2 years later, the second fleet did not get the citrus, and they did get 267 scurvy deaths. The convicts were generally well behaved aboard, so much so Phillip often unshackled them and let them roam on deck to get fresh air. That said, there were 3 half-baked attempts by some convicts to rise up, seize their ship and sail off to escape, but the rumours leaked and the ringleaders flogged. The first fleet had left England just as the summer approached, and by the time they reached the southern hemisphere they were also coming into summer, so they generally enjoyed good sailing conditions most of the way, though they did battle heavy seas for much of the long stretch after Africa. After the Cape, they sailed across the southern Indian Ocean, around Van Diemen's Land, and then Phillip's ship was the first to arrive in Botany Bay at 2:15 on Friday the 18th of January 1788. It had been 252 days since he farewelled England. On that same day, Laperouse was passing by Lord Howe Island, just 800 kilometres to the northwest, and sailing directly for Botany Bay. Within 2 days of Phillip's arrival, all 11 ships of the First Fleet were safely inside Botany Bay. It was impressive that no ships had been lost at sea. An Atlantic crossing typically had a death toll of around 10% aboard. For longer voyages, that average would rise to 15%. There was no longer voyage than England to Botany Bay, but the First Fleet death toll was 48, only 2%. Phillip's meticulous planning was paying off. David Collins was the Deputy Judge Advocate of the early colony and wrote about the arrival in Botany Bay.
Thus, under the blessing of God, was happily completed in 8 months and 1 week, a voyage which, before it was undertaken, the mind hardly dared venture to contemplate, and on which it was impossible to reflect without some apprehensions as to its termination. We had sailed 5,021 leagues, had touched at the American and African continents, and had at last rested within a few days' sail of the antipodes of our native country, without meeting any accident in a fleet of 11 sail, 9 of which were merchantmen that had never before sailed in that distant and imperfectly explored ocean.
We have well over a dozen journals from First Fleeters. They were recording an important moment in history, but a big part of the motivation to write these journals is that they'd be published and often quite lucrative. The most popular journal, and the most beautifully written, is from a Marine officer, Lieutenant General Watkin Tench. He too describes the arrival in Botany Bay.
The wind was now fair, the sky serene, though a little hazy, and the temperature of the air delightfully pleasant. Joy sparkled in every countenance, and congratulations issued from every mouth. Ithaca itself was scarcely more longed for by Ulysses than Botany Bay by the adventurers who had traversed so many thousands miles to take possession of it. To us it was a great, an important day, though I hope the foundation, not the fall of an empire, will be dated from it.
We started the last episode with a comparison of the American Mayflower and the Australian First Fleet. The American nativity story was a boatload of rugged individualists fleeing government oppression. The Australian nativity story was a huge state-sponsored project with people in chains. As a result of these highly divergent birth narratives, it is often said Americans dislike government, but Australians have big government ingrained DNA. This simplistic analysis is easily refuted. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Australia had a lower tax to GDP ratio than the United States. History contains endless lessons, but the past is not destiny. Join us next episode as the British are startled to see 2 large, strange ships arrive in Botany Bay.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.